it's an exercise in problem solving. I'm working on a book about how to write action movies. I did a film called, in addition to Pretty Woman, I've done a bunch of action things, including Under Siege and Chain Reaction and DOA and things like that. And so, the problem that I had was, how do you write a really great action sequence? And so you can, there's certain structural rules of how you write a movie, and action movies kind of fall into some of those things like the Joseph Campbell stuff. But action sequences are particularly different. And so I started to analyze it and try to come up with a strategy, a tool set for how to deal with these things. So one of the things is that action is relatively different. There's about 3,000 years, Tony was talking about changing, it's about 3,000 years of story theory, going back to 3-act structure and 2-act structure, and Aristotle and the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell and all of that. Shakespeare has 5-act structure. There's a lot of things, but the action movie, when movies started first coming out, they followed play structure pretty much, and they you would have like a cop movie that would have little bits of action in it, or you'd have a cowboy movie and it would follow certain rules of a cowboy movie with a little bit of action in it. But there's a difference between the old cop movies and detective movies and something like Die Hard, which actually is an action movie. And the difference you can analyze in terms of time. And so basically, there's a 3 to 5 minute rule of kind of people's attention span. So if I sit on this slide for 2 or 3 minutes, you're going to be okay. But if I start to go over 3 minutes on this particular slide without changing to something else, you're going to start to get a little antsy. It's why songs are usually about 3 minutes long. It's why comedy routines are usually broken into sections that are about 3 minutes long, or even dance routines and things like that. In film, you usually, a scene, if you cut to interior Smith Center, you can have a scene where people are talking for, a minute or two. You'll be fine just because it's a new location. If it goes up to about 3 minutes, they need to be saying something interesting. If it goes over 3 minutes, they really need to be saying something very, very interesting. If it hits 5 minutes, people are like, when are we going to go someplace else? But what's happened in films is, they originally started to follow that. Wings in the 1920s was about 2 minutes. Gone with the Wind, the big action scene in Gone with the Wind is 4 minutes. A kiss scene, though, would be about 4 minutes. Just a scene where they're talking and then they end up kissing. The big action scene was there. Stagecoach, which was around the same time, that had a huge scene that was very influential. It was 7 minutes. Hitchcock was a terrific action director. They were still pushing back. The big action scene in North by Northwest, the dust cropper scene that you always see, is only 3 minutes long. Then Ben-Hur did 9 minutes. And then Bullitt did 10 minutes. Now the reason everybody talks about the Bullitt action sequence is because it's 10 minutes long. It's because it passes that 3-minute line and you're still interested, and then it goes to the 5-minute line and you're still interested, and then it gets up to 10 minutes and you're going, oh my God, it's still interesting. And then you get to Star Wars, which was groundbreaking. It's 12 minutes long, and then by this point, it's not a sci-fi film, it's an action film. It's not a sci-fi film with a little action, it's an action film that's in a sci-fi world. And then you take a look at Aliens. The Newt Rescue is 16 minutes long. So as a problem, as a writer, not only do I have to think in terms of how do I deliver wow? How do I deliver wow in an action sequence? How do I also teach other people? Because as a producer, I work with other writers. How do I teach them? How do I approach them? So, what is great action? There's a kind of a feeling like, well, maybe just a writer, maybe it's just an instinctual thing, you're just born to it, you just know. I wrote most of my action scenes in Under Siege without even thinking about what I'm going to talk about, I just kind of did it from instinct. You kind of follow different things. But when I started to teach, I started to say, well, how do I explain this? And so is it just you put in more explosions? Well, that's okay. You put in bloody guts? Well, yeah, bloody guts, wake people up. Ferraris crashing through things. How do you come up with some kind of thing other than just say put in more explosions? So what is it that makes one action sequence great other than another one? Because we've all seen bad ones. There can be a great movie where you've got tons and tons of explosions and robots smashing things and whatever, and then you kind of just find yourself getting bored, kind of like, oh, when is it going to be over, And so what it is you have to keep the brain engaged. The other thing is there was a tendency in Hollywood for many, many years to assume that it's just an issue of directing. So in Bullitt, unquestionably, terrific directing, terrific cinematography, all the technical elements are there. It's the way it's shot, everything is there. But directing isn't enough because you have films like the first Indiana Jones, which has several incredible action sequences that are very memorable. You can watch them over and over and over again. And then there are the other Indiana Jones films of same director, same actor, and yet the action sequences don't pop, they don't wow in the same way. So maybe it's in the writing. So how do you make a well-written action sequence? Okay, well, Tony was talking about Joseph Campbell, so there are certain basic storytelling elements. An action sequence is a story. When you go past 3 minutes, and you're talking about 17 minutes or 12 minutes, you're basically telling a mini story. So you can follow the basic old rules of how you tell stories, that you believe in the hero, that you have a hero, there's a wish fulfillment, you want to see the villain defeated. Those things work, but that doesn't seem to be enough on action. So I looked at a lot of action movies, I started analyzing stuff, and I came up with my 7 action elements. And they are goal, locked room, obstacles, assets, ticking clock, puzzles, and peril. And originally there were 6, and then somebody suggested puzzles, and so I said, okay, well that's 7. Let's go for 7 lock. And again, these are not rules. It's not that every action sequence has to have these elements. The purpose of this is to create a tool set for me and for other writers so that when they go into something, they can say, okay, how do I fix it? I've got an action sequence that isn't quite working. And I think this is maybe something, again, that could be helpful in the kinds of management and problem solving that you do. Instead of thinking, okay, well, it always works when you do this, this, this. You say, well, what are the elements inside something that make it work so that we can apply them in different situations? So that it isn't that every action sequence has these things. These are things that you can use to go into an action sequence and make it better. So they're like ingredients that you can put in. So you take a basic fist fight and you say, okay, I've got a fist fight. Now if I put in 1 or 2 of these elements, I can make it better. I've got a car chase. It's not very good. It's only 2 or 3 pages long. The studio wants it longer and bigger. What do I do to it? Well, I can add some elements to it. So the first element is goal. Now you could say, well, technically any action sequence has to have some kind of goal, because even if there's robots smashing and crashing and your hero is running around, your hero doesn't want to be crushed or die, but it always helps to have a clear goal. And so you want to know what it is that the hero is trying to accomplish, because we've all seen these action sequences where there's a lot of chaos and you're not quite sure what the hero is trying to do. Is he trying to stop the robots? Is he trying to get away from the robots? Is he trying to get into the other robot to fight the robots? It's usually better to have a clear idea of what the hero is trying to do. So if you're having a problem with an action sequence, think of what's the hero's trying to accomplish. How do you make that clear? And then sometimes it can also be helpful to have an action sequence like, okay, there's a robot smashing in here. Our goal is to get to the exit, okay? But then the problem is there's so many people in the way that you have to go to a different exit. So in the middle of the action sequence, the goal can change. Oh, let's go out the window, let's go up the stairs, or different ways of solving. The next one is the locked room. Now, the locked room actually comes from Edgar Allan Poe, who created the locked room for the first detective story that he wrote. And by doing the locked room, he created the modern detective story, and action films follow from that have a relation to detective stories. And it was just a simple device. The device was there was a murder inside a locked room, and then it made the reader immediately go, well, how did that happen? And then immediately they have to think of, well, what's in the room? What are the elements that are in the room that make it, that could have killed him? What was in the room and all of that? And so that created the first detective story. And once that form came, actually, the room didn't have to be locked. You know, then you started having detective stories where they said, well, we didn't see anybody go in. Or then the detective story could be there's a house, or it can even be a bigger area. So in terms of action sequences, of course, the famous locked room is Die Hard. You put it inside a building, and all of a sudden, all the action is contained in a way that makes it interesting. So again, if you're trying to, Under Siege was on a ship, Speed was on a bus. So if you're having trouble with an action sequence, you could say to yourself, let's define the room that it is. What's the locked room that it is? The next one is obstacles, of course. And obstacles are the things that are getting in the way of your hero. Your villain, Darth Vader, he can be an obstacle. Obstacles can be natural elements like fire or wind or rain. They can be wild animals. They can be a gun turret, whatever. So you have to have obstacles that your hero is encountering and trying to overcome. Now, with obstacles, it's generally better for them to kind of emerge organically from, to some extent, the locked room and from the situation that you're coming in. If you think of the Bad B movie, the Bad B movie is first you have to go through the pit of fire, then you have to go through the past the tigers, then you have to go through this. And you know, you hear that kind of talk about it, and then the hero goes, does it, and then you get to the pit, and then you know there's going to be a tiger. It's generally better if you say something like, well, you have to get through to the other side of this thing, and then when they get there, they encounter a tiger. And then while they're dealing with the tiger, they encounter this quicksand or some other element. The next element is assets. So assets, obviously, like Indiana Jones, he has his whip. So Indiana Jones has a whip. What other assets does Indiana Jones have? The what? He has a gun and the hat. Yeah, the hat is a useful asset, actually, because you can use the hat in the desert. The hat's important. You can use it for water. You can do it. So it's very interesting in the very first action sequence. As he's running along, he catches his hat. He keeps his hat going with him. So obviously, James Bond has a car with a lot of assets. Now, assets generally are better to set up before the action sequence. You don't want to necessarily be in the middle of an action sequence and your hero pulls out a flamethrower. It's like, where did he get a flamethrower from? You want to, Batman. I've always had a little problem with Batman's utility belt. He's got anything he wants in it, but they kind of, you know that it's Batman, so he's got everything. In the Wild Wild West, James West, it was great. In the first few seasons, I liked it better because it was very clear what assets he had, and then later, as time went on, they just started giving him any gizmo that came around. But setting up what the assets are, this gets back to the locked room. There's certain, if you're having a fight in a kitchen, you don't have to explain where the person gets a knife or a cleaver, because the fight it's logical that in that locked room there are those assets or obstacles too. Ticking clock, that's a famous element too. You know, the most obvious one is a bomb that's going to go off in 10 minutes or whatever. But there are other ways you can do a ticking clock. It can be the walls are closing in. You can have sand going through a thing. It can be a rope that's fraying. Even the amount of bullets you have. If you've got a big action sequence and the hero only has 6 bullets, that the bullets become a kind of ticking clock. It can be you've got to do something before the sun goes down. There's a great ticking clock in the film Commando, where Arnold Schwarzenegger has to go rescue his daughter, and he kills a guy in this plane, and then covers up the body and tells the stewardess not to bother him because he's sleepy. And he basically, the ticking clock is when the plane lands, they're going to realize this guy's dead. So that becomes the ticking clock for the whole thing. A lot of times people always just assume that the shorter the ticking clock, the better. Sometimes that can undercut things. If you have, at the beginning of an action sequence or whatever, if you say, okay, you've got, 3 hours to go into Nazi Germany, kidnap Hitler, replace him with another person, then bring him back here and do this and do that. You're like, how can somebody do that in 3 hours? But if you say, well, you got 3 days to do that, then you can go, well, that's not enough time either. So you want the amount of time to just seem like a little bit less than the amount of time it should take. And then usually obstacles drag out that time and make it harder. Puzzles. This is the one. This is kind of like obstacles. I was on the fence about adding it, but 7 elements sounds better than 6. So I added puzzles. And puzzles are a little different because they're kind of brain teasers. They get into okay, you know that the obstacle in Terminator 2, you know the obstacle is that that you got to kill the Terminator, you got to get rid of the Terminator, that's kind of the goal, but you don't really know how you're going to kill him. And so it becomes a puzzle that they can finally pour him into the thing. In RoboCop, there's a fun thing where the boss can override him and then he gets fired and then he's independent and stuff like that. So puzzles can be another element that you can use to add in, that you can sprinkle into an action sequence. And then finally, one of my favorite is peril. So what is peril? Well, Superman can't be killed, he can move fast, he can do anything. So there's really no peril until there's kryptonite. And then you have real peril. Now sometimes you can have peril with Superman because somebody's going to kill an innocent or something, he's got to solve it. But really, until you've got kryptonite, there is no peril. So what you need to do is come up with ways that you believe that your hero is going to fail. Bruce Lee, he can kick anybody's ass. And so you see him in the beginning of Enter the Dragon, he beats up 5 guys, then later he beats up another 5 guys, then there's a big guy with lots of muscles and he beats him up too. So at the end, how do you come up with anything so that you can't even imagine that Bruce Lee might be failed? Well, you get a guy with a special blade arms and he's the bad guy and that gets into the thing. In Aliens is great because in Aliens, Sigourney starts off and she's just a ordinary girl who's runs a lift and whatever, and there are all these soldiers and they have all these guns and they're real badasses and everything, and then they go in and they get their asses kicked, and then she manages to save them, in the car, and then later she starts shooting aliens and she does a good job, and then she shoots more aliens, and then she shoots more aliens, and then gets to a point where it's like, okay, she can kick anybody alien's ass. So what do you do to finally get peril? Well, then you get the mother alien, who's bigger, and now you have real peril. Okay, so you need peril is just to give your audience a reason to believe, even though they kind of know your hero's going to win, that they might fail. So now let's go into some specific studies. So Star Wars, right? The goal is to destroy the Death Star. You hit the target. But what's brilliant about Star Wars is they weave into this 12-minute sequence an explanation of exactly how you have to hit the Death Star. These days, you'll see a lot of movies, they all know that you have to have a big explosion. They all know you have to blow something up like in Star Wars. There's some big thing, alien thing, and we got to blow it up or whatever. But very few of them follow Star Wars and have, look, to blow it up, you have to shoot into this one thing, and you have to shoot with this thing, and you have to go down this path. And in the process of going down the path, they create peril because they show 2 other people fail at it. So how is Luke going to do it? They have obstacles, they have TIE fighters, gun turrets,